If you've got your Bibles, I'd invite you to get them out. We are going to be finishing up, I think, the whole book of Daniel. Our sermon series, we've been doing this for quite a while now, and we finally got to the end. Hopefully today, hopefully we get it all in. I want to do, though, before we get to just kind of the first few closing verses of Daniel chapter 12, just kind of want to remind us where we are and how this story all developed and what's going on here as Daniel's life comes to a close and his writing comes to a close. If you've got your Bibles open, just turn to Daniel chapter 1, and we're just going to flip through the pages quickly here. It's on page 737 in the church Bibles, if you've got one of those. Daniel chapter 1. What did we learn from Daniel chapter 1? There's chapter 1 through 6 are 6 stories. And each story tells us something about the God that is writing to Daniel, the God that reveals himself to Daniel. And Daniel chapter 1 is that wisdom and understanding come only from God. Remember the story? Daniel's this 14-year-old kid that's taken captive by the armies of Babylon and end up taken to live in the court of the king in Babylon. And shortly, it becomes evident that God has given him more wisdom and understanding and insight than all of the wise men that the king of Babylon can gather around him. This little 14-year-old slave boy puts everybody to shame. And then in chapter 2, we learn that God is the revealer of mysteries, specifically the mystery that is the future. The knowledge of the future comes only from God. That's the whole story where Nebuchadnezzar, remember, he's going to kill all his wise men, not because they can't interpret his dream, because they can't remember, or because they can't tell him the dream that he can't remember. He doesn't even know the dream. Somebody's got to tell it to him. This is a whole miraculous story of how God is the only one who can answer these prayers. And he does. He's the revealer of mysteries. And then chapter 3 is the story, one of the most popular stories in church. Every kid in Sunday school knows this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? In the fiery furnace. And what's the story there? That God is able to rescue, that there is no power of this earth that can stand in the way of God rescuing his people. And then we get to Daniel chapter 4, and that's the story of the madness of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the story there is, the lesson there is that God is able to humble. He is able to take the most powerful man in the world and remove him from his throne. And he's able to change his heart so that he declares the lordship of Daniel's God, and God is able to put him back on the throne. It's all up to God. God can humble even the mightiest. And then chapter 5 is a whole other story. That's a guy who wouldn't be humbled. That's Belshazzar and Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall. And what we learned there is God is totally able to judge. He only lets things go so far, and then they're done. And he's in charge of when things end. He is able to judge. And then Daniel chapter 6 is really an interesting chapter. It's so rich. I got going on reading about Daniel chapter 6 and kind of putting some stuff together about it. It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And I think we could probably do a whole sermon again just on Daniel chapter 6. But we won't do it today. We'll do that another time. We'll keep going. But Daniel chapter 6 is really a picture of Daniel's entire life when you think about it. Because think about how Daniel starts the story. Okay? A country and a king bent on wiping out Israel and assimilating its people. And in this whole assimilation and conquering piece, a boy is taken captive by an invading army. A boy that's to be educated and trained to leave his Judaism and his God behind and become a Babylonian. And Daniel's whole life is spent in a lion's den. Daniel, as a boy, was thrown into the court of the most powerful man in the world, surrounded by people who have vastly more power and authority than he does. And the question is going to be, right off the bat, will Daniel's faith in God survive this? Or will he be devoured by the powers of Babylon? Well, we know what happens. We know that who really turns out to be in control in this story. Not only does Daniel not turn from his God, Daniel's faith in his God lasts a lifetime. And God uses the faith of his servant Daniel to cause emperors and kings to declare for all the greatness of Daniel's God. Not only did God protect Daniel for one night when he was thrown into a pit with actual lions, God protected Daniel for his entire life from all who wanted to devour him. God is sovereign over all. There is nothing, there is no one who escapes his notice, and no one who is beyond his power. One way to say the whole point of the book of Daniel would be this: God has a plan, and he is entirely able to accomplish it, no matter what the opposition. The stories of Daniel chapter 1 to 6 reveal God's power and sovereignty, and that he is in charge and no one else. And that's important because God's also going to actually share some of his plans with and through Daniel. God's not leaving any room for any doubt about the reliability of the information that he's going to share with Daniel about his plans. And before we continue, let's just stop for a second. Let's just pray and ask God to move us with his word this morning. God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the words we've already sung and the worship that has been declared for the praise of your great Son. And as we open your word, we ask that you would move your spirit in our hearts and you would transform us and make us more like you, make us love your Son more, and cause us to put our faith once again in the God who is in charge of it all and the God who saves. We ask of these things in your name. Amen. Okay, so there's basically 2 times in Daniel's life that God kind of has this direct encounter with him. When Daniel was in his mid-60s, think about this, 50 years after he was taken captive, and he's a guy in his mid-60s now, he gets 2 visions from God. They're 2 years apart. And those are recorded in Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 7 is the vision of the 4 beasts, and then it transforms into the vision of the Son of Man and the court of God, and the Son of Man arriving, and judgment of the nations and judgment of the beasts. And then going way back for that one. Daniel chapter 8 is another vision that God gives Daniel, and it's the vision of the ram and the goat, and about the Greek and Persian empires and what's going to happen. And that whole thing happens in Daniel chapter 8. 20 years after that, though, 20 years of no silence, no more visions. 20 years later, Daniel's an old man at the end of his life, mid-80s, and God is going to choose to deliver 2 more messages to him. And all of that is recorded in the last 4 chapters of Daniel chapter 9 through 12. Just have a look at Daniel chapter 9 for a second, because it really sets the stage for the rest of the book. Daniel's chapter 9 starts with Daniel's prayer for his people, and we've talked about this several times. Daniel knew the prophecies that Jeremiah had written, and Jeremiah had told the Israelite people that, hey, you're going to be conquered, you're going to be taken captive, but it's only going to last 70 years, and after 70 years, I'm going to regather you into my city again. And it's 70 years later now, and Daniel is 85 years old, and he's waiting to see what's going to happen, and he reads Jeremiah's prophecy, and he's like, hey, it's time. And he starts to pray to his God about the future and what's going to happen to his people. And you'll notice in Daniel's prayer this, God, when are you going to deliver us? God, when is this calamity that has been inflicted upon your people going to end? When is the desolation of your city and your temple going to end? Chapter 9, verse 18 says, open your eyes and see our desolations. It's like, God, look at what's happening to us. How long is this going to go on? When will the desolation and the calamity finally end? So God sends Daniel some answers. And the first answer that God makes is recorded here in chapter 9. It's at the end. There's just a few verses there. It's probably some of the most famous verses in Bible prophecy or Bible eschatology. It's the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and that's God's first answer to Daniel. It gives him some details about all of this and the Messiah coming, and there's a lot of detail in there. We don't have time to go over it, but it's God's first answer. But notice what it isn't. it's not the message that Daniel's hoping for. He gets an answer, but it's not all that pleasant. Because basically what Gabriel tells him in that message is, yes, Jerusalem will be built again. God is going to do that, but it's also going to be destroyed again. Probably not the message that Daniel was wanting to hear. In fact, in verse 24, Gabriel tells him, to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Gabriel's like, hey, this is never going to let up. There will be war and desolations and suffering for your people until the end. Not only are desolations determined, we find out, but a final desolator has been determined as well. A king who will arise at the end of the age and inflict an unprecedented amount of suffering on Daniel's people. So, 2 years after that vision that's given in Daniel chapter 9, God sends Daniel another vision. Daniel's praying and he's fasting, remember, and he's out with some guys by a river, and these messengers are dispatched to Daniel at that time, and he falls down on his face, and he passes out because it's so overwhelming, and the guys that are with him, they all run away, and he's left there by himself, and he has a vision of, I believe, the pre-incarnate Lord at that time over the waters, kind of the man in linen, that it was so frightening that he caused Daniel to pass out. Daniel 10:12, tells us the point of these messages. And they're the same as the point of the messages before. God wants Daniel to know some things about the immediate future and some things about the distant future. And in Daniel 10:12 it says, fear not, Daniel, from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. They're coming again to give Daniel more answers. And the rest of the chapter is these heavenly beings trying to revive Daniel enough from his shock that he can even hear and understand the messages that they have been sent to deliver to him. And this information session that follows, this is the same kind of pattern as all the other ones. Some things God reveals about right now what's going to happen, and then the future, what's going to happen. But the whole point is the latter days, right? Daniel 10:14 says right there, I came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. And the angel goes on, then the messenger goes on in chapter 11, verses 2 to 20, to give Daniel more about the immediate story. What's going to happen next? Right? This is the section, remember, that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. This is a section of the Bible. This is probably more contested than anything else. This is the section of Daniel that basically eliminates its validity in the minds of the world as something that could be authentic to Daniel. There's so much detail in what happens here in this story and how it corresponds to actually what happened in history in the wars of the Diadochi after the fall of the Greek Empire and Alexander died. There was a tremendous amount of war in the region to try and snatch power there. And that's a description right there in 11 to 20 of all of those interaction over the next multi-generational war that's going to happen in that, and the treading down of the people and the trampling of Israel as the king of the north and the king of the south fight back and forth over that territory. Now, if we actually believe that there's a God who created everything by the power of his word, that he brought everything into existence out of nothing, how hard would it be for him to tell Daniel a few things about what's going to happen over the next few years? I don't think this would disqualify this from being a true book. We believe in a God who can do anything, and he reveals the future. But just like before, this message of what's going to happen next, Daniel, transforms or jumps forward in time. And in verse 21, all of a sudden the subject changes into this coming king that's coming. And it gives a description of the time leading up to the end and what this desolator that has been announced is going to be doing as the end of the age approaches. And then we get to verse 36 through 39, and it's a description of the desolator, much like we've had a couple of other descriptions before. What kind of character is he going to be? What kind of person on the world stage? How is he going to behave? What's he going to look like, not physically, but what's his activities? What's he going to do? God has already mentioned this guy several times. He's mentioned Daniel a couple of times. In chapter 7, he's called the little horn. If you look back there, you can see some descriptions of the little horn. If you look back in chapter 8, he's called the king of bold face. You can look for descriptions of him there. And then we have the descriptions here in 36 to 39. And then it changes in verse 40 to 45, a description of, you can see it written right there, of the time of the end. The time of the end of the desolator, what he's going to be doing as we get to the very final days of this age. Which brings us to the closing statement in chapter 12. And we went over some of this a little bit a couple weeks ago, but let's just get through chapter 12 here, and we can see how this story of this great interaction ends up. I don't know why I keep saying Genesis. Daniel 12:1 says, at that time, at what time? At that time that we just talked about, at that time of the end of the age, with the king, the desolator is encamped with his armies in the land of Israel. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. Almost sounds like a good setup right there, right? For good news, right? Your great prince is going to, all this desolation and destruction and suffering, and in the middle of it, your great prince is going to rise up. But no, it's not good news. It's actually more bad news. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never been since before there was a nation till that time. All the trouble that your people have been experiencing, Daniel, all the trouble that's going to transpire between now and then, that's nothing. That's nothing compared to what's coming when your prince, Michael, stands up to fight for you. It's going to get worse. But at that time, your people shall be delivered. Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Good news, Daniel, the great tribulation that your people are going to experience in the last days, this terrible time of increased suffering, this is when the prayers that you have been praying for your whole life are finally going to come to pass. Because out of all that suffering and out of all that tribulation is going to come your salvation of your people. And I will deliver them. I know all their names. I have them written down. I will not miss a single one. They will all be saved. Verse 2 goes on to describe a couple other things that happen there. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. There's going to be some kind of resurrection. Some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above. There's going to be some people who know what's going on. There's going to be some people who are preaching the truth and telling other people about what's really happening in this world. And those people, they will shine like the brightness of the sky above. And there's going to be those who turn many to righteousness, and they're going to shine like the stars forever and ever. This will be a great dividing day for all of humanity. Then verse 4, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Okay. Basically, he's like, that's all I got to say, Daniel. I know you're not going to get all of this, but here's the deal. Stop writing, put your stuff away, and go on with your life, because this is going to take some time. I said this before this morning in the first service. We don't need to think of this as some kind of special thing, this words in the ceiling, like it's some kind of magic trick that somebody's going to learn the combination and there's going to be some kind of special secret that's going to be. It just means you can't understand it. You're going to have to wait. Everybody's going to have to wait until these events begin to unfold before the things that I have said are really going to make sense. But don't worry, one day they will. is what he's saying. Many would run to and fro, and knowledge would increase, and shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. And if there's one thing we've heard in Daniel, there is going to be a time of the end. And these words will be rolled out, and they will be understood in ways never understood, never possible to understand in Daniel's time. Verse 5 then goes on. We kind of have the concluding little story here, another little interaction. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. So remember, Daniel was out in the city somewhere or in the countryside with his buddies, and they are praying, and a man in linen appears, the glorious figure appears above the river, and all of the other people run, and Daniel's left there. He's had this interaction, and now he looks up, and he sees two other beings standing beside him on the sides of the river. And then verse 6 says, and someone said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the stream. Okay, so this is a reference back to the very original guy that Daniel talked about in Daniel chapter 10 as the man clothed, the one that when he first saw it, made him pass out. He's still there. And someone, one of these people that's or beings that's beside him on the river, turned to this man and ask him a question. And they say, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? How long is this going to take, is what he's saying. How long is this tribulation and suffering and all the desolator and the armies and the back and forth? And how long is this story that you're telling me here? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. Okay, so this is one of these things you need a lot of discussion about if you want to understand how ever we're confident of this. But just let me tell you, time means year, times means 2 years, and half a time means half a year. Okay, we can get into all of why that's true. We don't have time to this morning. But what he's saying basically is, hey, it's going to be 1 year plus 2 years plus a half a year. It's going to be 3.5 years this whole story is going to take. And that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. Notice what he's saying here. This is going to take 3.5 years here. And in the end, it's all going to result in the shattering of your people. I'm not sure Daniel would be super happy with that news. In fact, in verse 8, we see Daniel's confusion. I heard, but I did not understand. He's like, what do you mean? What do you mean it ends in our destruction? That can't be the end of the story. And so then I said, oh my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? Okay. What happens after that is what he's asking. Hey, we can't just end with the shattering and the conquering of your people, Lord. What happens after that? Notice the answer. He said, I'm not telling you. Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the end of time. He says, many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. Again, Daniel, you're not going to understand. I can't tell you. Just so you know, one day there will be people, though, that do understand. But this is just like God now. After God's, I want to encourage Daniel. Right? I want to give him more than that. That's not much to go on, not much hope to go on when it all ends in shattering. And so he adds on these two little sentences at the end. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Okay, so once the burnt offering is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, when that event happens, there's going to be 1,290 days after that. That's when the shattering of your people is going to be complete, 1,290 days. But notice what he goes on into verse 12. Just gives him this little hint. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. 45 days after that, Daniel, there's going to be blessing. That everything is going to change. Blessed is he who makes it to that day. And again, verse 13, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest and stand in your allotted place at the end of days. It's kind of like the Old Testament version of well done, good and faithful servant. Daniel, you did it. You were faithful to the end. Have your rest, and you will stand where I have placed you to stand in my kingdom at the end of days. Pretty cool story, actually. A lot of stuff in the book of Daniel. I'd love to actually go back and just do it all again right now. There's so many things. So many things about who God is and what he's doing in this world and how he is able to do it all. I always say God rules the universe with his feet up. He's not sweating. He's not anxious. He is working out his plan with no problems to stand in his way. Now, I say all of that today because there seems to be a lot of excitement about some events that are coming up this week. A lot of trepidation about some things that are coming up this week. What's going to happen in this world? There's a lot of guessing about what's going to happen, is there not? There's a lot of people prophesying about the future right now. People are predicting who will win, and they're predicting what that will mean and how people are going to respond to this election that's happening on Tuesday. And everybody's wondering, what's the impact that this is going to have on our world? What are the changes that this is going to bring to people? What are the consequences of these things that roll out this week going to be on the future of us? Let me remind you once again, as the followers of Jesus Christ, we don't need to get too caught up in these things. Okay? We don't need to tie our hearts to the political maneuverings of the kingdoms of this world. And look, I'm as interested in what happens next week as anyone is. I read Facebook. I watch the news. It's all very fascinating to me. And I won't deny that there are probably going to be immediate implications to whatever happens. But just like when Daniel inquired of God about the future, God took the time to tell him the reality of the times that he was living in as well. And then he quickly readjusted Daniel's gaze. He took Daniel's gaze off of the things of this world now and refocused Daniel on the ultimate reality behind it all. What's going to happen in the end is what God really wanted to get across to Daniel and what he really wants to get across to all of his followers. Just like Daniel, we live in the reality of what God has declared for our day and age. He is in charge right now. But more importantly, we look to the sure and certain reality that is to come. I'm not saying that our upcoming events of this week are unimportant or totally insignificant. Of course, these things will have an impact on our world. And I'm not saying we shouldn't care either. We should live like Daniel for the good of the place that God has put us in this world. We should do our best to know the signs of the times and our place in God's unfolding story. We should care about and pay attention to our world and what's happening. And we should try to be understanding and wise and discerning. But let's keep things in perspective here. Let's remember there is a much bigger picture going on. Because we all have a much more significant day circled on our calendar than November 3rd, 2020. Tell you what, don't do this often. I am going to prophesy this morning. Okay? Here's my prophecy. At the end of the day on Tuesday, the sun will set, and the moon will rise, and the stars will shine, and everyone will go to sleep in their beds as usual, and then they'll wake up on Wednesday morning, and the sun will come up, and we'll all get up, and we'll all get on with our day, and life will go on. That's my prophecy for this week. Yes, there will be an impact on our world from Election Day, but let me remind you, whatever that impact is, no matter its extent, is incomparable to the impact on this world that's coming on the day of our Lord. And God has told us in His Word that this day is going to be unlike any other day that has ever been. There's not going to be any confusion over what day it is. Just listen to what Jesus showed John about this coming day. He says, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. And the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the throne of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Jesus said about that, at that time will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Let me just point out for us all that no matter what happens this week, no matter the ramifications that those events will inflict upon our world, it will all be, in the end, absolutely incomparable to what God has in store on the day that He comes back into this world. Nobody's going to be looking at or waiting for or thinking about anything else on that day. Because on that day, the veil between heaven and earth will be torn away, and the armies of heaven will arrive, led by our King. And He'll be holding salvation in one hand and judgment in the other. And all these things that fill the headlines in the hearts of our world today, they'll be relegated to the category of former things, and they will all pass away in an instant. The band's going to come, and we're going to sing. Whatever happens this week should not be confused with what's going to happen in the end. They are incomparable. Because our King is sitting enthroned in heaven right now, and one day He is going to get up, and the King of glory is going to come to this earth, and He's going to take His rightful place as King of kings in this world. And all the nations of this world will kneel before His throne and declare Him Lord of all and worthy of the praise of all of heaven and all of earth forever. And nobody will remember November 3rd in 2020. Let's sing.
Who is this King of glory? Beautiful and matchless one. Who is this King so holy? Every knee will bow at His throne. Jesus, the glorify you, Lord. saves us.